Okay, great. Well, welcome everyone to the first meeting of the Raven Research Group for the comparative study of feasting, cuisine, and aromatics in ancient Greece, traditional China, and Aboriginal North America, other places if you so desire. I really want to thank you all for coming. Thank you for responding positively to my invitation when I was first setting this group up last summer. And I just want to officially thank the institutions that have sponsored the event, which are MacEwan University, who's provided us space and some technical support, and the Center for Health and Culture in the Department of Family Medicine at the University of Alberta, who has paid for the catering. And so I appreciate that very much, and thank you, Dr. Wah, both for being a good citizen in that regard, and again for agreeing to join this motley crew, because I'm quite positive that some people were attracted to it because of your involvement. So I appreciate that. So I'm so glad that no one ever asked me, why did you call it Raven? So apparently it was fairly clear, or at least unobtrusive to people. But when I was studying comparative mythology and religion, or alongside studying classics as an undergrad, I became interested in myths of Raven, both in North America and in Siberia, and was, I guess, very attached to the idea that this bird had a role in creating the world and also in discovering humanity in different stories. And how does Raven do this? Well, through curiosity and general hunger and desire for new things. And so Raven, in some stories, brings the sun. Raven consumes food in the world when it's dark. After bringing the sun, he then creates land by digesting his food. And also in some other stories, Raven, through hunger and curiosity, finds the first human beings in a shell as he's floating around. So in terms of studying feasting in all these different spheres, it seemed a figure like Raven, who's always seeking out food and discovering things along the way, seemed like a good icon for us. Now, so I'm going to talk a little bit about my background in the field of studying food and feasting in antiquity, what got me interested, and then what I've become interested since then, since I got you guys on board and started thinking about your fields. And so as I expanded my thinking about food and feasting outside my training, I've become interested in some issues, and I just wanted to share that with you and to give us some basic guidelines for the rest of the meeting. So here's the schedule. You've all seen this. From the beginning, I said you may give short work-in-progress papers, 5 to 10 minutes. That's absolutely no problem. Some people have sort of the beginnings of papers, real works in progress. Some people have more completed papers. Feel free to speak for between 5 and 25 minutes in your time slot. And please don't feel that there's any problem with you having a short paper. That is what I invited from the get-go. So these half-hour time slots are really to facilitate the discussion that I hope will happen after all the papers, okay? So as I was working on my dissertation, which has to do with ancient Greeks banqueting with non-Greeks as a context of contact, as an interpretive model for other evidence of cultural exchange. That is, if you can demonstrate that people were banqueting together, then other things that were exchanged between these populations become interpretable by the banquet. Okay, so we know they were feasting together. Well, at feasts there are sacrifices, prayers, songs, dance performances, decorated furniture and feasting equipment and all this stuff that can promote cultural exchange in the arts, in poetry, religion, and all sorts of intellectual property can be borrowed and adapted in this context. So that's what I was writing about, and at the same time there was this proliferation in studies about ancient feasting. And so I have some of the books here on the screen, and I brought a sampling of what I've been reading. So these are all published in the last 10 years. We have Festivals, Feasts, and Gender Relations in Ancient China and Greece by Yikun Zhu. The most influential book here is Marek Wachowski's 2014 The Rise of the Greek Aristocratic Banquet. And Egbert Bacher, a professor of Greek at Yale, produced this study, The Meaning of Meat and the Structure of the Odyssey, where he looks at feasting episodes in the Odyssey and argues that they are the primary structuring elements of the narrative. That the narrative proceeds from feast to feast, and the feasts sort of mirror one another and foreshadow and recall one another throughout the epic. Now, I also work in ancient Near Eastern studies and am generally interested in the anthropology of food and feasting. Here are some other books. Again, important books come out in the last 10 years that influenced my thinking while I was writing the dissertation. Dinner at Dan, that's Tel Dan in Israel, a site that has very good evidence for Israelite cult at an early period, that is early in the first millennium BC at Tel Dan. And Jonathan Greer writes a book about the dynamics of feasting in the archaeological record at Tel Dan. Then Peter Altman has a book about, especially the book of Deuteronomy and the religious rules around feasting and the festive calendar and the kinds of feasts that are prescribed in Israelite religion. And that is a very rich book. In my area of interest, there are feasts attested in the Hebrew Bible that have specific prescriptions for how you are to treat the outsiders. So the outsiders, the others, are expected to be at the feast, and there's special rules for how they are to be configured at the feast. This is very interesting to me. Because I think that feasting with the other is an sort of essential category both in the history of literature and also in the history of diplomacy, and how states and elite groups relate to one another. So in the area of general anthropology of food and feasting, we have Martin Jones's very important book. There's a copy of it here, Feast: Why Humans Share Food. It has evidence from all over the world, but his special evidence comes from a Neolithic site in Eastern Europe that has where he is able to comment on the feasting habits of people around 10,000 BC. So it's very remarkable. And then a brand new book that attempts to encapsulate the entire field of the anthropology of food and feasting is Carrie O'Connor's The Never-Ending Feast. I recommend that. It has chapters on feasting in ancient Greece, feasting in China, feasting all over the place in Carrie O'Connor's The Never-Ending Feast. So my interests as I pursue research with this group are going to be building on what I did in my dissertation and this book that I'm working up in these areas here. Okay, so feasting as a mediator of intercultural contact is basically the same as saying feasting in diplomacy. We know that this is a feature of diplomacy now, and it's a feature of diplomacy as soon as we have any evidence of diplomacy going back to the late Bronze Age. I'll give you an example. The Hittites have specific rules for safe conduct through their territory. And so if the Hittites are going to give safe conduct to someone, they present that person with bread and beer, and that is the symbol that that person can then expect to not be harassed as they travel through Hittite territory. There's really food as a diplomatic token, and of course that still happens today. But I was reading an article about how the Canadian Navy and the one of the navies of the Scandinavian countries have a dispute over an Arctic island in the vicinity of Greenland and Iceland. And so what happens is one of the navies goes and plants their flag, and they remove the flag of the other country, but they leave a bottle of liquor of their own. So the Scandinavians leave something like schnapps, and they leave their flag. And aquavit, sorry. And then the Canadians come by, say, oh, the Scandinavians have been on our island again. And they take down the Scandinavian flag, put up the Canadian flag, and leave a bottle of Canadian whiskey for next time the Scandinavians come around. So anyway, food, feasting, and drink in interstate contact is important today. It was in antiquity. So now, in addition to this interest, feasts are, as I mentioned, a performance context for epic and religious poetry, really cultural performances of all kinds. And I'm particularly interested in how a feast can be used as a model to interpret all this evidence of intercultural exchange we have in my period in archaic Greece. But really, in any of your fields, if you're able to find different populations, different in terms of language or some other cultural indicator, and they're feasting together, then I would encourage you to use that as a context through which to interpret other evidence of intercultural exchange. Now, generally I'm interested in feasts and food as terms of distinction between human beings and gods, and between different groups of human beings. So in ancient Greek texts, gods 99% of the time don't eat food. They eat ambrosia and nectar, they like the smell of sacrifice, but they don't eat food. But then in the Homeric hymn to Hermes, Hermes gets hungry for meat and slaughters a cow and divides it up into portions for all the gods. So most of the time, the gods don't eat, but they crave the aroma of sacrifice. So anyway, food and feasting is a term of distinction between humans and gods. And of course, it defines the sacrificial relationship. And the taboos present in ancient Greek culture are often articulated at feasts between humans and gods. So there are primordial feasts, say, between Tantalus and the gods, where Tantalus violates a taboo. He offers a cannibalistic feast to the gods. The gods reject this feast and punish Tantalus eternally in the underworld. So again, sort of ideas about appropriate ways of conducting food and feasting on the human side and on the divine side. And feasting is a term of distinction between the two. Now I'll just say that in Homer's Odyssey, food and feasting is the primary index of cultural difference. So if Odysseus is going to encounter people that he regards as monstrous, inhuman, outside of the realm of normal human behavior as he understands it, that's usually going to be marked in the text by some bizarre food practice, like cannibalism, eating only one type of food like lotus, eating, strange situations where the Odysseus and his companions believe they're being hosted to a banquet, but it turns out that they are the food at the banquet. So again, more cannibalism. But this is one of the usual terms of distinction between the normals, sort of people who behave within the normal bounds of human behavior as understood by Odysseus, and those who are somehow aberrant. It's often encoded in food habits, feasting habits. Now, as I was thinking about the people who joined this group, we've got a lot of expertise in religion here. And I've been uncomfortable with something about my training for a while now. And that is that rational explanations for religious behaviors or special sacrifices or treatments of food have really been, I've been trained to eschew rational explanations for things like a pork taboo. My teachers said any rational explanation is secondary. You have to understand it from an emic perspective. Why did they reject this type of food or that? And the pork taboo is interesting because with modern science, you can observe that pork is a meat that contains more microorganisms in sort of freshly butchered pork than in beef or chicken. So it is, if you're going to keep it in the pre-refrigeration kind of culture, then it poses more dangers. But when I put that to experts in religious studies in my graduate education, they did not care that there was any kind of rational explanation for why there should be a pork taboo in the ancient Near East. We're not interested in this. But thinking about the fields represented here, it seems to me that the entire field of ethnobotany says something different. They say that there are traditional uses of plants and foods and natural products that may be, from the emic perspective, encoded in just sort of as some appropriate behavior vis-a-vis the gods, or some sort of just purely an explanation that is all about something idiosyncratic to that culture. But then when it's investigated by an ethnobotanist, they say, oh, well, we tested it and it has these properties that are healthful for human beings. And so I've been really thinking about the different special foods that are involved in feasts, and often these are religious feasts. I've changed my mind, and I think that it is perfectly reasonable to query what scientifically determinable health benefits or other benefits might be derived by the consumption of these plants. So some examples, after I founded the group, I started doing some research into foodstuffs and medicinal value, and so thyme and oregano, separately or in combination in different cultures around the world, are used to treat respiratory ailments. The thyme has been tested in some medical research. The oregano has not been tested in the sort of appropriate medical research. So if you sell an oregano product, an oregano oil, and you claim it has health benefits, in the United States anyway, that's illegal, because that happened. People were selling oregano oil, they said it had health benefits, and they said, you never tested this, no one knows that that's true, and they weren't allowed to do that anymore. With thyme, it's a different situation. The thyme has been shown. This is really interesting to me because these are herbs that are included in our festive meals in this culture now. Parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme, you eat them at festive meals, especially in the winter months when you're likely to have some kind of respiratory ailment. And I'm unwilling to accept the idea that this is not the result of some sort of trial and error process where people were including things in food that ended up benefiting them positively. So I've recently discovered that ancient Greek cassia, which I'm familiar with from archaic Greek poetry, it's a relative of the cinnamon plant. It is common in teas. It's called senna, and it has some demonstrated benefits for gastrointestinal conditions. The stuff that I've been reading about sage is absolutely amazing to me. I know Scott Habkirk knows quite a bit about smudging. I imagine some other people here know a lot about smudging with sage. So in two separate articles, these were medical researchers working with sage and claiming on the one hand that burning sage successfully fumigates spaces for periods of hours. So you burn sage and it actually reduces the bacterial load in the air. Now, I don't know how much meaning we can derive from that, but it has been demonstrated. And that sage oil has an effect on cognitive function, kind of like caffeine, where people who have been exposed to sage oil then perform a bit better on cognitive tests. Anyway, so and then there's a research joint project at Johns Hopkins in Tel Aviv, researching into frankincense, where they're studying it for its antipsychotic properties. And this, to me, is fascinating. So, people for 1,000 years in Europe would gather into churches, and there would often be censers burning incense. And people might go to church and come out of church feeling good, as is often reported today. When people go to church, they come out of church, they say, that just made me feel good. Now, if you get everyone in the community into one building and you burn a bunch of frankincense, and it turns out that frankincense has antipsychotic properties, well, that's probably pretty good for the community at large. And, I had never thought about these valences of these substances in incense and food before, and then I got you guys together and I started thinking about it. Turns out there's a lot of research along these lines. So. Now, I'm approaching the end. So I've become interested in the idea that there are a number of different scholarly cultures on the globe. There's ours, which is supposed to include also the French, German, Italian, and Spanish-speaking world. That's our scholarly culture. There's also Chinese scholarly culture, and a Russian scholarly culture, a Portuguese-speaking scholarly culture, Japanese scholarly culture. Because of the ubiquity of food, there will be idiosyncratic ways of analyzing food and feasting in each of these scholarly cultures. I have, very thankfully, I have a research assistant at MacEwan now. He insists on being a volunteer because his work permit hasn't come through, but he's a Chinese national who's graduated MacEwan's accounting program, and he took a classics class with me, and what I noticed about this student was that they had very astute things to say about Homer that were quite apart from any readings I had assigned. So I asked him what he'd been reading, and he said, "Oh, you won't be able to understand, but I've been reading all these Chinese articles about Homer, and I'm in class, I'm making comments based on what was said." Now, nothing that he said was unknown to me, but it was very sophisticated for an undergrad to bring it to class, and So me and Wen Liu have been working through Chinese bibliography in the sense that I'm telling him what issues and areas of study I'm interested in. He's then searching Chinese scholarly databases and making annotated bibliographies in English for me. And hopefully this will turn into an article where I can simply report on the state of the study of ancient feasting in Chinese scholarly culture with the bibliography and things like this. But so I would encourage this kind of approach. I mean, some of you have competence in some of these languages I'm talking about, and I'm sure, for example, that in the Arabic tradition, there are idiosyncratic ways of understanding food and feasting that might be completely unfamiliar to me or us, but that might be helpful in our analyses as we pursue our topics. I just want to encourage the global study of feasting and recognizing really especially the elephants in the room, like the Chinese scholarly culture that we so happily ignore, but there's Chinese scholars studying the ancient Mediterranean too, and studying all of our subjects, and we don't know a lot about what they're doing necessarily. So the comparative orientation of this group is intended to inspire new perspectives and new directions in our fields. Now, there's some mythical song that Chris Christopherson supposedly wrote. Other musicians talk about the song, but I don't think the song has been recorded. But more than one musician, including John Cash. Yes, Ben? Oh, so it's a real song. So Chris Christopherson wrote a song called "Let's All Get Together and Steal Each Other's Song." So with all sort of academic courtesy intact, that's what I would like us to do: learn from one another's approaches and develop new perspectives in our own fields. Okay, so let's let the song stealing begin. And this is the end of my introductory remarks. I invite any comments on what I've said, if anything resonates with you, or questions before we move on to the next step.